The night of lights and whispers. The crowd outside the studio was buzzing. People held signs, phones in hand, faces glowing with excitement under the late evening sky. They weren't just here for a regular taping of the Jimmy Fallon show. Tonight, something special was expected. Keanu Reeves was making a rare guest appearance. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was electric. Stagehands moved swiftly, adjusting cameras and lights. The familiar desk and couch sat under the spotlight, and, behind them, the glowing city backdrop flickered. The audience murmured, some whispering stories they had read about Keanu. The kind gestures, the train rides, the quiet donations, the humility. He wasn't just an actor to them. He was something more, something rare. Backstage, Keanu stood, silently, dressed in his usual black jacket and worn boots. He wasn't one for flashy entrances or rehearsed jokes. He preferred listening over speaking. As makeup artists fluttered around, he politely nodded and thanked them. To him, every person mattered. Every moment was a chance to bring peace. "You nervous?" asked the young assistant, barely out of college, clutching a clipboard and looking at him like he was a living legend. Keanu smiled gently. "Not nervous, just aware." The assistant tilted her head, confused. "Aware that words can build people up, or tear them down," he said. Just then, the producer gave the signal. It was time. The crowd erupted as Jimmy Fallon danced onto the stage with his usual energy, waving and clapping, cracking jokes with his signature grin. He leaned into the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very, very special guest tonight. He's the internet's favorite person, your favorite action star, and probably the only celebrity who would help you change a tire at 2 a.m. Keanu Reeves." The applause was thunderous. Keanu walked out slowly, not in a rush. His presence was calm, centered. He gave a small wave, shook Jimmy's hand, and sat down. They exchanged a few opening jokes. Jimmy asked about Keanu's latest project, and Keanu shared a story about filming in the mountains, how a snowstorm had stranded the crew for 2 days and he had cooked pasta for everyone using a portable burner. The audience loved it. But then, something changed. Maybe it was the pressure to be funny. Maybe it was just for laughs. But Jimmy leaned in, smirked, and said, "Keanu, you're like the nicest guy ever, right? But come on, don't you ever get tired of being so painfully humble?" The audience chuckled awkwardly. Keanu smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I mean," Jimmy continued, trying to keep the mood light, "you're the only guy in Hollywood who's richer than half the country and still takes the subway. What is that? A PR stunt? Or are you just trying to win Saint of the Year?" A few people laughed, unsure if they should. The studio lights suddenly felt too bright, the laughter too sharp. Even the band seemed to hesitate with their background. If Keanu looked at Jimmy, not angrily, not even with sadness. He just looked, deeply, sincerely. It was the kind of look that made you stop breathing for a second. "You know," Keanu began, his voice low and clear. "There was a time when I had nothing. No home, no roles, no peace. I've walked the streets alone, not because I wanted to be seen, but because it was the only place that felt real. People think kindness is a performance. Maybe because they've never needed it like oxygen." The room went quiet. "I take the subway," he said, "because it reminds me I'm not above anyone. I've sat next to people who lost everything and still offered me a smile. Those are the real stars." Jimmy shifted in his seat, suddenly less confident. His eyes darted to the camera crew. The audience was silent. Keanu continued, "I'm not trying to win anything. I just know what it feels like to be invisible. And if my being kind makes someone feel seen, then I'll keep doing it, even if it's mocked." For a moment, there was no laughter, just stillness. And then, slowly, a quiet applause started. It grew. Louder. Real. Not the kind prompted by a flashing sign, but the kind that rises from the soul. Keanu nodded gently and turned to the audience. "Thank you," he said softly. Jimmy tried to recover. He joked about himself being the real, emotional one wiping imaginary tears. But it didn't land. Something had shifted. Something real had just happened, and everyone in that room knew it. After the show, backstage, the assistant from earlier caught up to Keanu. "That was powerful," she whispered. He smiled. "Truth usually is." She paused. "Are you okay?" He looked at her, eyes kind. "I'm always okay if I can remind one person to stay gentle in a world that teaches them not to be." Outside the studio, the night air was still. The fans were gone. The lights dimmed. But inside the hearts of those who had witnessed it, something had been lit, a spark of something rare, something unforgettable, and it had nothing to do with being famous. It had everything to do with being human. Behind the laughter, the weight of silence. The sun had long dipped behind the skyline when Keanu stepped out of the studio through the side exit. The street was quiet now, the echo of applause still fading from memory. He didn't take the limousine waiting at the front. He preferred walking. It helped him feel present. Real. In his world, peace never came from noise. It came from stillness. Cool breeze brushed against his face as he walked down the dim sidewalk, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. The city around him bustled with energy, but inside him there was a silence, a kind that most people mistook for loneliness, but was actually something deeper. Reflection. The words from the show still lingered. Not just Jimmy's jokes, but the crowd's laughter. The way the energy shifted when truth entered the room. People weren't expecting it. They came for comedy, for a light night. But Keanu had given them something else. A mirror. He thought back to the early days of his career. Sleeping on a friend's couch, scraping together meals, walking to auditions with holes in his shoes. No one cared then. And he hadn't wanted them to. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing purpose. A reason to keep going. Yet somehow, kindness had become a spectacle. He had seen it before. The way people praised a celebrity for tipping a waiter or helping someone cross the street. But Keanu always found that strange. Wasn't that just normal? Human? As he walked past a closed flower shop, he noticed an old woman trying to lift a heavy crate into a delivery van. Without thinking, he crossed the street. "May I help you?" he asked. The woman looked up startled, then her eyes widened. "Oh my," she breathed. You're Keanu Reeves," he smiled gently. "And you're carrying something heavy. May I?" She laughed nervously, still in disbelief. "Of course. Thank you." Keanu lifted the crate like it weighed nothing and slid it into the back of the van. The woman wiped her hands and looked at him closely. "I saw you on TV tonight," she said. "You were honest. It meant a lot." He paused. "Thank you." "People don't talk like that anymore," she continued. "Not on television, not anywhere." Keanu nodded, his eyes soft. "Maybe we should." The woman reached into a paper bag beside her and pulled out a single white lily. "Take this, for being you." He hesitated, then accepted it. "Thank you truly." He walked away with the flower in hand, the scent subtle and clean, and for a moment he felt something he hadn't in a while. Connection. Meanwhile, across town, Jimmy Fallon sat in his dressing room scrolling through comments on his latest show, his usual habit. He liked to see what people were saying, what jokes landed, what needed work. But tonight something was different. The top comment read, "Keanu didn't just answer a question, he opened a door we forgot existed." Another said, "Jimmy tried to be funny. Keanu chose to be real." As he kept scrolling, the feedback wasn't angry. It was reflective. People weren't attacking him, but they were awakening. Many were thanking Keanu for reminding them of something they hadn't felt in years. Jimmy leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Had he crossed a line? He hadn't meant to be cruel. He thought he was being playful. His whole show was built on laughter, teasing, and energy. But tonight felt different. Maybe he hadn't read the room right. Or maybe he hadn't read the man sitting across from him. "You okay, boss?" His producer poked her head in. "Yeah," he muttered. "Just thinking." She stepped in. About the show? About Keanu, he said slowly. Do you think I was off? The producer hesitated. Honestly? A little. But it wasn't just you. It was how powerful he was in return. Most people get defensive. He didn't. He just told the truth. Jimmy rubbed his forehead. I didn't expect him to respond like that. Maybe you should invite him again, not as a guest, but as a teacher. The thought lingered. Back in his small apartment, Keanu placed the lily in a glass cup by the window. He didn't have vases. He liked things simple. The flower caught a bit of moonlight, glowing faintly in the darkness. He sat on the couch, staring at it. He wasn't angry with Jimmy. People joked when they didn't understand, when they were afraid of being too sincere. Sometimes humor was a shield. Sometimes it was a wall. But underneath all of it, people still wanted something real. Something that reminded them of who they were before the world told them to pretend. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. Your clip is going viral. Already 5 million views. People are calling it the moment of truth. Keanu stared at the screen. He didn't feel pride. He felt hope. Maybe it was working. Maybe if people saw that gentleness wasn't weakness but strength, they'd stop being afraid to show it too. Across the country, in homes big and small, people replayed the clip. They paused at Keanu's words. Some cried. Some called loved ones. Some wrote posts about being better, kinder, braver, because something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. And, in a world so used to noise, the truth had found its way through, quietly, humbly, beautifully, just like Keanu. Whispers in the world that never sleeps. Keanu woke up early the next morning, just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. Golden light filtered through his curtains, soft and warm, painting streaks across the wooden floor. He sat quietly at the edge of his bed, hands resting on his knees, listening to the gentle hum of the city coming to life. Birds chirped somewhere outside, and distant traffic rolled like ocean waves through the streets of Los Angeles. But his thoughts weren't in the present. They wandered back to the night before, not to the cameras or the spotlight, but to the silence that followed. His words, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward. It was sacred. He had learned long ago that silence, when received properly, could be more powerful than applause. After brushing his teeth and tying his hair back, he made a cup of black coffee. He stood by the window, sipping slowly, still wearing yesterday's thoughts like a coat. The internet had exploded overnight, but he hadn't opened a single app. He didn't need to. When truth is spoken, it carries itself across hearts like wind over water. The people who need it will find it. He turned off his phone. Today, he wanted to be unreachable. Not because he was avoiding anyone, but because he needed to ground himself again. He had no interest in trending. He was more concerned with tending to the parts of his soul that still believed in love, in strangers, in second chances. Meanwhile, in an office suite high above Midtown, Jimmy Fallon sat in a glass-walled meeting room surrounded by his writing staff. Laptops open, coffee cups everywhere, whiteboards covered in scribbles of jokes and ideas. But today, no one was laughing. The room was quiet, the usual chaos stilled by the weight of reflection. I messed up, Jimmy said finally, breaking the silence. His team looked at him. I made fun of a man who has done nothing but show kindness his whole life, and he didn't snap back. He didn't humiliate me. He just spoke truth. And that truth hit harder than anything I've ever said in 20 years on television. A young writer leaned forward. But maybe that's why people are talking about it, because it wasn't a rehearsed moment, it was real. I don't want to just be talked about, Jimmy said. I want to grow. He rubbed his hands together slowly, eyes unfocused. Do you know how long it's been since I actually thought about the meaning of what we do? We bring joy, yeah. But what if we could bring something deeper? What if this show could become more than just laughs? His producer raised her eyebrows. You're talking about changing the format? No, he said. I'm talking about changing the heart of it. That same day, in a diner tucked away on the edge of Santa Monica. Keanu quietly sipped his second coffee. He liked this place. The waitresses knew him by name but never made a scene. He sat at the far corner booth by the window, reading a paperback book about ancient philosophy. His mind liked to wander through old words. It helped him make sense of the new world. As he turned the page, an elderly man approached his table. "Excuse me?" the man said softly. "Are you Keanu Reeves?" Keanu looked up and nodded. "I am. I saw the clip," the man said. "You spoke from the heart. I haven't seen that on TV in a long time." Keanu offered a gentle smile. "Thank you. My son and I, we haven't spoken in 5 years. We argued. Words were said. Pride took over. Last night after watching you speak, I called him. We talked. We're having lunch today." Keanu's heart stirred. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man added. "I'm glad," Keanu said. "Sometimes the hardest bridge to cross is the one we build ourselves." The man nodded, eyes glistening. "It only took one sentence from you to remind me." Keanu sat alone for a while after that. The waitress refilled his cup, but he barely noticed. His mind drifted to how strange it was that one moment, one truth, could ripple outwards and change lives that weren't even in the room. He didn't feel powerful. He felt responsible. And in that responsibility, he found peace. Later that afternoon, his assistant finally convinced him to look at some of the responses online. There were stories. A teenager wrote, "I was going to end things. I thought no one saw me. Then I watched that video. You reminded me that being kind to others starts with being kind to myself." A nurse wrote, "I've been working double shifts for weeks, exhausted, angry. Then I watched Keanu speak. I brought coffee to a patient's daughter who hadn't slept in 2 nights. She cried, I cried, thank you." And one message, unsigned, simply read, "Your words made me want to be better. I don't even know why. They just did." Keanu closed his laptop. He didn't need to read more. He didn't want to lose himself in screens. The world was happening outside. And his mission wasn't to go viral. It was to go deeper. But fate had more in store. That evening, a well-known journalist contacted Keanu's team. She was producing a feature story called The Price of Sincerity, and wanted Keanu to be at the center of it. His assistant was unsure. This could amplify the message even more, but it could also twist it. Keanu thought for a long time. Then, he said, "I'll do it, but only if the story is about everyone, not just me. Kindness is not a brand, it's a birthright. We just forgot." And so, under flickering studio lights and in quiet coffee shops, in homes, classrooms, hospitals, and offices, people were reminded, not by flash or fame, but by a man who simply told the truth. And as the days passed, a question echoed in hearts across the country. What would happen if we all chose to respond with kindness instead of applause? The echo no one could silence. Days passed, but the moment hadn't faded. It wasn't a headline anymore. It had evolved into something softer, quieter, yet far more powerful. It had become a conversation. Not the kind spoken loudly on camera, but the kind shared between hearts in kitchens, whispered between co-workers in lunchrooms, and passed like folded notes in classrooms. Keanu Reeves had not given the world a performance. He had offered a reflection, and it was still being stared into. Keanu, meanwhile, had retreated deeper into his usual rhythm, simple mornings, long walks, and quiet moments with strangers who didn't need anything from him except presence. That was the kind of fame he believed in, the kind that left you more connected to humanity, not less. His assistant had tried to schedule more interviews, more press, more appearances, but he politely declined almost all of them. "I didn't speak to be seen," he told her. "I spoke so people could see themselves." One morning, while walking through Griffith Park, Keanu noticed a boy sitting on a bench with a crumpled notebook in his hands. The boy couldn't have been older than 15. He looked frustrated, his fingers gripping the pen tightly like he wanted to write something important but couldn't find the words. Keanu sat on the opposite end of the bench, far enough to give space, close enough to offer safety. After a while, the boy glanced at him. "You're Keanu Reeves," the boy said. Keanu nodded slowly. Yes. The boy hesitated. I saw what you said on TV. My teacher played it in class. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Did you like it? The boy looked away. I didn't understand it at first, but then I thought, maybe I don't have to be loud to be strong. Keanu smiled, his eyes gentle. You don't. The boy unfolded the notebook. On the top of the page were the words, My dad left because I was too quiet. Keanu took a breath, not to respond, but to hold space. The boy looked up. He said I wasn't like the other boys. He said I didn't fight hard enough. Keanu leaned forward, his voice soft. Sometimes silence takes more strength than shouting. The world needs warriors, yes, but it also needs poets. It needs people like you. The boy blinked, his throat tight. Do you think I'll be okay? Keanu placed a hand on the bench between them. You already are. In another part of the city, the fallout from that night continued to shift. The landscape of late-night television. Jimmy Fallon had made a decision that stunned his producers. He wanted to dedicate a full episode to real stories. No scripts, no monologues, just truth, kindness, and vulnerability. He invited nurses, teachers, delivery drivers, even a teenager who started a community pantry from her garage. He also invited Keanu back, but not as a guest. As a listener, when Keanu arrived at the studio, he wasn't met with flashbulbs. Instead, he was welcomed into a quiet green room where people sat with cups of tea, sharing stories with one another like old friends. The show didn't begin with jokes. It began with silence, and then a single voice said, I was invisible, but now I know someone sees me. Through the hour-long broadcast, the world saw something new. Laughter mixed with tears, applause wrapped in reflection. No one was trying to be viral. They were just trying to be real. And in that vulnerability, millions of viewers found their own strength. After the taping, Jimmy and Keanu stood backstage. You changed something, Jimmy said. Keanu shook his head. No, we all did. I just reminded people of what they already knew. You made me rethink everything, Jimmy confessed. Not just the show, but the way I talk to people. Keanu smiled. That's the beginning of everything that matters. As they parted, Keanu stepped into the cool night air and walked without purpose. He didn't need one. The city stretched out before him, humming with life and potential. He passed people who smiled at him, not because he was famous, but because he had reminded them that being human still mattered. At a small bookstore near the corner of Melrose, he paused. Something drew him in. Inside, it was quiet. The air smelled of old paper and stories yet to be finished. An elderly woman behind the counter recognized him but said nothing. She just nodded and returned to her crossword puzzle. He wandered the aisles, fingers trailing over spines until one book caught his eye. The cover was plain. The title read, The Loudest Truths Are Spoken Softly. He opened it and read the first line. In a world addicted to volume, stillness becomes rebellion. He closed the book and smiled. As he walked home that night, the streets felt different, not because they had changed, but because the people walking them had. His words had been a spark. And now, all across the city, candles were being lit in hearts that had almost given up on softness. A young girl walked past him, holding her mother's hand. That's the man who was kind on TV, she whispered. Keanu didn't turn. He didn't wave, he just kept walking. Because he knew now the work wasn't in being seen. The real work was in continuing to choose grace when no one was looking. And somewhere deep in the quiet folds of the night, the world listened. Kindness becomes a movement. The days grew longer. Spring softened into early summer. And with each passing moment, the ripples Keanu Reeves had unknowingly created began to crash into distant shores. Places he'd never been, lives he'd never met. What started as a quiet moment of honesty on a comedy stage had become something no one, not even he, could stop. It was as if the world had been waiting, starved, for someone to say what everyone felt but couldn't name. And now that the truth had been spoken, it echoed louder than any performance ever could. But Keanu didn't chase headlines. He never did. While others might have jumped at the chance to capitalize on the attention, to turn it into a tour or campaign, Keanu disappeared again into the unnoticed corners of the city. Those quiet places where real life happened, where pain didn't wear makeup and love didn't need a stage. One afternoon, he wandered into a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years. It was where he used to live when money was tight, where he would sit on a fire escape at night with a cup of noodles, watching lights flicker across windows like distant stars. The old building still stood, aged and worn, a memory held in brick as he passed. A voice called out, "Hey, wait, is that you?" He turned. A middle-aged man with grease-stained hands and tired eyes was standing in the doorway of an auto shop. Keanu smiled. "Mario?" Mario laughed, his hands outstretched. "I thought I'd never see you again, man. Still driving that old bike?" Keanu chuckled. "When it runs." They embraced briefly, like old friends do. No fanfare, just warmth. "You remember," Mario said, "how you helped me carry groceries to my mom's place? You didn't even know her, I always remembered that." "It was just groceries," Keanu said humbly. "Nah," Mario replied. "It was a reminder. People forget how far a small act can reach." They sat on the curb outside the shop, drinking lukewarm coffee from styrofoam cups. Mario spoke of how the neighborhood had changed, more expensive, more distant. People rushing past each other, buried in phones, drowning in noise. But after that TV moment, something strange had started happening. Kids began holding the door, open again. Neighbors offered help without asking for anything in return. Strangers left notes that simply said, "You matter." "What you said," Mario said slowly, "it gave us permission to be human again." Keanu looked down at his cup. He didn't feel worthy of such praise. He had only told the truth. And yet, maybe that was what the world was desperate for. Not perfection, but permission. Permission to care, to stumble, to be soft in a world that worshipped steel. A few weeks later, a movement began online. It wasn't started by celebrities or corporations. It was started by a high school teacher in Montana who shared a video with her students and challenged them to do one quiet act of kindness a day. Her students responded. Then their parents. Then their friends. Soon, it had a name. The Keanu effect, but it wasn't about Keanu. Not really. It was about what he represented. A man who could sit on the floor of a train and make someone feel like they belonged. A man who didn't need a camera to be kind. The hashtag became a thread connecting people around the world, each one adding their own story. An elderly woman left food at a neighbor's door every morning without ever being seen. A firefighter saved a kitten and adopted it instead of leaving it at the shelter. A child wrote letters to nursing home residents who hadn't been visited in months. A barista paid for a customer's coffee just because. Thousands of small moments. Too quiet for the news, too beautiful to ignore. Keanu heard about the movement from his assistant, who showed him an article in a popular magazine. He read the headline aloud. "The man who reminded the world that kindness doesn't need a stage." He looked up. "I don't want this to be about me." His assistant nodded. "But it's already about everyone." That's the point. Meanwhile, Jimmy Fallon was changing too. His producers noticed it first. He no longer rushed through conversations. He asked deeper questions. He invited guests who weren't just actors, but people doing real, meaningful work. He started ending each episode with a question. "What's the kindest thing someone ever did for you?" Audiences responded with stories. Calls flooded in. Letters arrived by the truckload. People wanted to talk, not about scandals or gossip, but about humanity. And for the first time in years, the laughter on his show wasn't just noise, it was healing. He reached out to Keanu again. "I want to do a special, not just an episode, something that can live forever." Keanu was hesitant. "Only if it's not about image." Jimmy smiled. "It's about impact." So they began working on something new, a series called Moments That Matter, a platform to highlight real people and real stories. No scripts, no fame, just truth. And Keanu wasn't the star, he was the bridge. He helped connect the dots. And in doing so, he connected hearts. In one episode, they featured a janitor who spent his nights teaching kids to read in the back of a community center. In another, a young girl who built prosthetic limbs for free using a 3D printer. In another, a mother who opened her home to teens who had aged out of foster care. Each story was a universe. And each time, Keanu sat quietly in the corner listening, holding space, sometimes saying nothing at all, because he knew silence could speak louder than applause. Then one night, after a long taping as the crew packed up and lights dimmed, Jimmy approached. "Keanu, do you ever get tired?" he asked. Keanu looked at the empty stage. "Sometimes. But then someone reminds me why it's worth it." Jimmy tilted his head. "Who reminded you this time?" Keanu smiled softly, a kid on a park bench, with a notebook, and a heart too big for this world. Outside, a small group of people stood waiting, not for autographs, not for photos. They held candles. One by one, they lit them and passed the flame. A girl stepped forward and whispered, "We're not here to see a celebrity. We're here to say thank you for showing us that being kind is still cool." Keanu nodded, emotion tugging at the edges of his calm voice. Kindness doesn't need to be cool. It just needs to be chosen. And so, under the quiet stars, with no flashing lights, no red carpets, and no booming headlines, a man who never asked for attention changed the world, not by being louder, but by being softer. The man who never raised his voice, yet moved the world. The moon hung low over the city that night, casting silver light over rooftops and alleyways, flickering across windows like gentle reminders of something timeless. But beneath the quiet of Los Angeles, something even quieter was happening, something rare. People weren't talking about trends. They were talking about truth. They weren't watching stars. They were becoming them, each in their own small, humble way. And it all traced back, like a quiet thread, to a man who never wanted to be followed, only understood. Keanu Reeves stood on the balcony of his modest home, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. He didn't own a mansion in the hills. He had always said, "A home should hold peace, not pride." From where he stood, he could see the gentle lights of the city blinking like signals. But what he really saw were stories, the faces behind those windows, the lives being quietly healed, not by him, but by what had awakened through him. The final episode of Moments That Matter had aired earlier that evening. Unlike the others, this one was filmed without a script, without a plan, and without a host. It was a live stream of people from around the world, children, teachers, grandparents, doctors, farmers, sharing acts of kindness that changed them. Not dramatic, not sensational, just real. A little girl in India who saved her lunch every day to feed a stray dog. An ex-convict in Ohio who now taught young men how to build furniture with their hands. A nurse in Ukraine who stayed behind to care for abandoned elders in a war zone. Story after story poured in, woven together with raw simplicity, and between the spaces of their words the audience didn't find sadness, they found hope. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that listens, the kind that lives. Keanu hadn't spoken a single word during the broadcast. He had simply watched, silently, from behind the camera. When the stream ended, the crew clapped, not for ratings, but for reverence. For the rare experience of witnessing humanity at its best. Jimmy approached him afterward with misty eyes. "You know," he said, "all these years I thought success was being the loudest person in the room. But you showed me it's about listening to the quietest." Keanu nodded slowly. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one carrying the most. He walked outside and stepped into the night, letting the breeze brush against his face. Fame had never changed him, and now, strangely, it had circled back to him, not to consume him, but to finally reflect him. He wandered through the streets alone, the way he used to, not to disappear, but to reappear among the people who had always mattered most, the unseen, the overlooked, the ones with trembling hands and unspoken stories. These were his tribe. Not the rich, not the powerful, but the beautifully broken souls still willing to try. As he passed a late-night cafe, he noticed a small commotion outside. A man in a wrinkled suit stood yelling at a barista, furious about a mistaken order. The barista, barely 19, looked like she was about to cry. Keanu stepped in. Not with force, not with anger. "Just presence, sir," he said quietly. "She's doing her best." The man turned, irritated, then froze. Recognition flickered across his face. "You're—" Keanu raised a hand gently. "It's not about me." The man's shoulders dropped. For a moment, the tension dissolved. The anger softened. Something about Keanu's tone, unthreatening yet powerful, shifted the moment completely. The man apologized, awkwardly, and walked away. Keanu turned to the barista, who was still trembling. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, eyes wide. "Thank you. No one ever steps in like that." Keanu smiled. "Someone always should." She wiped her face, managing a nervous laugh. "You're not like other celebrities." Keanu leaned closer, voice steady. "I'm not trying to be." He walked on into the night, but the moment stayed. The girl would remember it. So would the man, and so would the people who watched it later because, of course, someone had recorded it. They always did. But for once, it wasn't to mock. It was to marvel. The clip would go viral again. But this time, people didn't just repost it. They reacted to it. Not with comments, but with action. They forgave old grudges. They gave their seat to someone tired. They told their kids they were proud. They reached out to people they hadn't spoken to in years. They started fundraisers, wrote anonymous thank you notes, and left flowers on strangers' doorsteps, all without asking for credit. It wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about seeing others. Weeks later, a journalist asked Keanu during a rare sit-down interview, "Did you ever think a moment of honesty on a comedy show would start a movement?" Keanu looked down at his hands. "I didn't think anything," he said. "I just felt. We live in a world that's loud, fast, and often cruel. But that night, I just wanted to remind people that gentleness is still a form of strength." The journalist paused. "And what now?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Now, I go back to listening. The world doesn't need another celebrity. It needs more kindness. And that doesn't come from cameras." When the interview aired, people cried. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. People longed for honesty like water. And Keanu had become, in a way, a well. In the months that followed, the Keanu effect faded from the top trends list. But it didn't vanish. It transformed into something quieter, more permanent. It lived in how people talked to each other, how they forgave, how they slowed down, how they remembered that being human wasn't about status but about connection. One evening, a boy in a wheelchair rolled up to a bus stop and saw an older woman struggling to carry her bags. He offered to help. When she asked him why, he simply smiled and said, "I saw a man do it once and it stayed with me." Far away in a city Keanu had never been to, a mural appeared on the side of a crumbling building. It showed a quiet figure standing in a storm, offering an umbrella to a stranger. Beneath it, the words, "Be kind, even if no one's watching." Keanu Reeves never commented on the painting. He didn't need to, because by then, the message had moved far beyond him.